Unit 3, Examining the Inverted Spectrum. Section 1, The Concept of the Inverted Spectrum. The inverted spectrum is a very early thought experiment in the history of consciousness studies. Indeed, many people report thinking up the basic idea in childhood. It postulates the possibility that two people could share their color vocabulary and color discriminations, whereas in reality, the colors they see, their color qualia, are systematically different from each other. And of course, if color qualia can be inverted, then so can other and maybe all qualia. The philosopher John Locke in the 17th century invited us to imagine that we wake up one morning to find that, for some unknown reason, all the colors in the world have been inverted. Furthermore, we discover that no physical changes have occurred in our brains or bodies that would explain this phenomenon. Traditionally, if you find the inverted spectrum plausible, then you have to accept A, that qualia exist, and B, that qualia are non-physical entities. However, some philosophers find it absurd that an armchair argument can prove something to exist. Also, the detailed argument involves many assumptions about conceivability and possibility, which are open to criticism. The idea that an inverted spectrum would be undetectable is also open to criticism on grounds of scientific principle. There's also some practical evidence against the inverted spectrum. For example, there are more perceptually distinguishable shades between red and blue than there are between green and yellow, which would make red-green inversion behaviorally detectable. Dark yellow is brown, qualitatively different from yellow, whereas dark blue is blue. Similarly, desaturated bluish red is pink, qualitatively different from saturated bluish red, whereas desaturated greenish yellow is similar to saturated greenish yellow. There are also subjective counter-arguments. Many cultures associate certain colors with certain sensations or moods. For example, red is a warm color, whereas blue is cool. The anti-inversion argument is that there's something inherent in the physical bases of these colors that leads to these associations. Finally, identity theorists would argue that it's impossible for a given brain state to produce anything other than a given quale in our universe, again, making the inverted spectrum an impossibility. In his book, I Am a Strange Loop, Douglas Hofstadter argues that the inverted spectrum argument entails a form of solipsism, in which people can have no idea about what goes on in the minds of others. Hofstadter goes on to present several arguments against the inverted spectrum, such as, firstly, an inverted sonic spectrum, in which low musical notes sound like high ones, and vice versa, which he claims is impossible because low sounds can be felt physically as vibrations. Secondly, an inverted political spectrum, in which one person's concept of liberty is identical to another's concept of imprisonment. And finally, Hofstadter pushes the inverted argument to absurdity by asking why complex qualia, such as riding a roller coaster or opening presents, aren't randomly reversed, such that everyone would perceive the world in radically different, unknowable ways. On this first solipsistic point, Hofstadter's theory that the self is based on strange loops entails the notion that the reality of other selves is actually represented in our brains by lesser loops. So, in addition to our own major self loop, our brains are populated by numerous lesser loops, which represent the people we know. Hofstadter says that, quote, advocates of the inverted spectrum riddle would spurn any suggestion that you and I actually are already inside each other, even the littlest bit. Their riddle is predicated upon the existence of an unbridgeable you-me chasm. That is the absolute inaccessibility of one person by one person of any other person's interiority. In other words, belief in the inverted spectrum is a close cousin to belief in Cartesian egos, end quote. This is a reference to Descartes' idea that as divinely implanted souls, human selves are inevitably and fundamentally isolated from each other. In the Cartesian world, there can be no interpretation of human selves. Personally, I believe that mirror neurons are a less abstract and more plausible mechanism for bridging the Cartesian interpersonal chasm than Hofstadter's strange loops. Mirror neurons do in fact represent a more recent and empirically grounded refutation of the Cartesian interpersonal chasm. Mirror neurons were discovered in the early 1990s. In a nutshell, they are neurons that react to experiencing the behavior of others. They were first discovered in an experiment involving two monkeys. One monkey picked up a peanut, and as the other monkey watched this, neurons in his brain began firing. Exactly, in fact, those neurons which the observing monkey would use if he was going to pick up the nut. In other words, our nervous systems tend to mirror the behavior we perceive in others. An example would be entering a room where a stranger is weeping. You have no idea why this person is expressing this emotional reaction. Nevertheless, some of the neurons in your brain, which you would use to weep, will immediately be activated. You will instantly feel an intense pang of sadness and an impulse to weep yourself. The strength of this reaction varies between individuals. The philosophical implications of the discovery of mirror neurons can be summarized as follows. Rather than being skin-encapsulated egos, peering out at our fellow creatures and struggling to analyze and interpret their behavior, we are, in fact, hardwired to be empathetic. We react to the manifest behavior of others, especially our conspecifics, automatically and without control from the higher brain centers. This means that the traditional philosophical problem of other minds isn't a problem at all. We are constantly and spontaneously reacting to the mental and emotional states of those around us. We don't need to construct an inner theory of other minds to work out what other people are feeling. Our nervous systems are hardwired to experience this immediately and directly. People with autism suffer from mind blindness. They probably simply have no mirror neurons. And psychopaths may recognize other people's motives and emotions, but feel no necessary impulse to empathize with them.